Welcome to the Rapid Response Series, Did You Know? CIUS Answers, a daily response to your questions about Russia's war against Ukraine. With us today is Dr. Marko Stech, a writer, literary scholar, and specialist in the history of culture. He is the Director of CIUS Press and scholarly publications at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. Marko, our question for you today, is the Ukrainian language the same as the Russian language?
Well, the very simple answer to this question is no, it is not. Both of these languages are in one family of Slavic languages. And in this family, there are a number of other languages like Polish, Czech, Slovak, Bulgarian, Serbian, Croatian, Slovenian, and Belarusian and other languages as well. All of them are not very far apart from itself. I would compare them to, for example, Italian and Spanish, which are also in one family, and where you basically can understand a number of words, the general gist, but you really, unless you study that language, you do not understand it very well. There was a myth created in the Soviet Union and in the Russian Empire that all Ukrainians understand Russian, that these languages are so similar. But actually, whenever the question was vice versa, whether all Russians understand Ukrainian, it didn't work that way. It was simply because Ukrainians were forced to learn Russian at school. And they were also in one information space in which there was a lot of information in Russian. The majority of information was in Russian, and every Ukrainian basically knew Russian. Also, there was in the space, information space, there was Ukrainian language, and the Russians were tending to understand it. However, from the linguistic point of view, they are by far not the closest languages of the Slavic family. For example, Ukrainian is much, much closer to Belarusian language. These two languages, according to the work of the phenomenally authoritative linguist, Professor George Shevelov of Columbia University, who wrote a phenomenally important book on the historical phonology of the Ukrainian language, he proves linguistically that while Ukrainian and Belarusian come from the same source of the certain Slavic dialects, Russian comes from a different. Through its historical development, actually, Russian became much closer to Bulgarian than to Ukrainian. And this is because both languages were affected, as all of the languages of the so-called Slavia Orthodoxa, meaning the Slavic Orthodox civilization, were affected by the Old Church Slavonic, which was primarily Old Bulgarian. However, while Ukrainian accepted from it basically much of the vocabulary and some elements, it did keep its own basic structure and grammar, while Russian was based to a much larger extent on the Old Church Slavonic, and thus it's actually much closer to Bulgarian. Now, there was a very important period in the 19th century and in the 20th century in which everything was done by the Russian government, initially by the Russian imperial government, later by the Soviet government, in order to Russify the Ukrainian language, and as much as possible to bring these two languages as close together as possible. In the 19th century, officially, the Russian imperial government denied the right of the Ukrainian language to exist. There was a very famous quote by Petr Valuyev, the Minister of Education, who said that there has not been, there is not, and there cannot be a Ukrainian language. At the same time, this language, which seemingly didn't exist, was on a number of occasions very harshly banned, prohibited. Anything to be published in this language was prohibited, and a very strong campaign of Russification was conducted. However, the Ukrainian language proved to be resilient to it. But then the next huge sort of challenge came in the 1930s. In the 1920s, during the fairly lenient time of the Soviet rule still, Ukrainians established, sort of formalized the rules of the Ukrainian language. And in 1928, the creation of the Ukrainian orthography, it was based on all Ukrainian existing dialects. It was the state of the art work on the Ukrainian language. This was absolutely unacceptable to the Soviet government. Stalin, in the 1930s, during the terror campaign, executed basically everyone in the institutes of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences who had anything to do with these. And he set new people, specialists in the Russian language, who created a new Ukrainian language, new orthography, which was as much as possible close to the Russian. For example, certain words were simply banned or prohibited. Certain letters that don't exist in the Russian language were prohibited. And throughout the Soviet time, there was this pressure on the Russification of the Ukrainian language and on bringing these languages as close together as possible. This did have impact on how people spoke in Ukrainian. However, the language still proved to be more resilient. And after the 1991 Declaration of Independence, it has been consistently reclaiming its legacy and gaining back its true sort of color and dimension. Once again, to respond to your question, no, Ukrainian and Russian is certainly not the same language. They are two separate Slavic languages of equal value.
Thank you, Marko. We'll be back tomorrow with another question and answer about Ukraine.